All right. Good afternoon, and thank you everybody today for joining us on this webinar, How to Pick Your Particulars, Descriptive Metadata for Digital Collections. I'm Biz Gallo. I'm the Statewide Digitization Initiatives Coordinator, and my job is to help libraries and cultural memory institutions around the state digitize their materials, preserve them, and provide access to them. So we've been having this webinar series for a while now. Last year, we did the Digitization Basics webinar series, which you can find on our YouTube page. I'll also drop a link in the chat. But this year, we've been doing the How-To series that goes a little bit deeper into a lot of the topics that we covered last year. And today, I'm thrilled to have Marianne Swierenga from Western Michigan University join us to speak about metadata because she is the metadata guru. Before we get started, I would like to just go over some housekeeping really quickly. This webinar is being recorded so that you can have access to the content again later, along with a copy of the slides. The recording should be available next week, allowing time for captioning. And once that's available, you can view it on the Library of Michigan's webinar archive. There will be time for Q&A at the end, but if you have questions throughout, feel free to drop them into the chat. If you have any technical issues or audio issues, please reach out via the chat to either myself or to Becky. And last, you will receive a copy of the slides that will have links to some of the resources that Marianne mentions at the end. So you don't feel the need to scribble down things really quickly. Those resources will be shared, so don't worry about that. But other than that, I'm going to hand it over to Marianne, and I am very excited to learn more about descriptive metadata.
Okay, well, I'm really excited to be here to talk about metadata. I am a cataloging and metadata librarian, so I kind of live and breathe description. So today's topics, we are going to start with a very basic description of what metadata is. Then we can cover how to plan for the description of your digital collections through designing and creating a metadata map or a metadata application profile. And I'll follow that with some guidelines and tips on creating helpful descriptions to your digital objects, and then talk briefly about some tools and resources, and of course, time for questions at the end. So I'm going to be using the word metadata quite a lot today. What do you think of when you think of metadata? Have you worked with it before? So I have just a quick poll to kind of get the, the temperature of the room about your familiarity with metadata. And Biz should be able to put that up. And, oh, there it is. So it can range from, I don't know much about it, that's why I'm here, to I'm aware of it, but I want to learn more. And you've created some, but of course you want some extra tips for how to get better. And you create metadata all the time. I'm excited to see everybody's responses. Okay. Oh, polls in. All right. So it's a good mix. I'm excited to see that. So a couple that are looking for some early basics. Looks like the next is you create metadata all the time. Excellent. I'm happy you're here. And the next I'm aware of but haven't created it. That's about 31%. Nice. And yeah, it looks like solidly in the lead as I've created some, would like to get better. That is a great place to be. And I think we'll have something for everybody. Okay, so let's get started by describing what metadata is, kind of at a pretty high level. So if you go online at all, you probably have already encountered metadata in the wild. And if you've done online shopping, you've relied on metadata. Because metadata tells us useful things about the items you want to buy. I like to use this kind of example of a shirt, just a real simple t-shirt. How would a retailer want to describe this shirt so that you could not only find it online, but want to buy it? What would that even be possible to find this shirt without metadata? So think about all the information we want when we're trying to buy a shirt. We want to know the size, the color, the fabric, the manufacturer, the price, the rating. All of this information is what we're looking for. So we're kind of using this type of metadata every time we shop. And of course, when that metadata is missing or if it's wrong, we might not even find this particular shirt. And if we order it and it's wrong, that is not a great experience. So when we think of library metadata, we're probably thinking of catalog records, the descriptive information that allows you to find the book or the media you want in the format you want. Catalog records have their own kind of structure and rules, which helps you find that helpful information. Like if the stand is the ebook or the print book or the audiobook, and what year it was published, how many pages if it's a print book, if it's the movie or if it's the miniseries. All these things are helpful for you as a user to find what you're looking for. And there's also administrative metadata kind of behind the scenes that allows a library to manage that item, find it within their collection, check it out, and know who has it and when it's due back. So metadata, especially descriptive metadata, is used in online digital collections to offer item level access to materials. So often these materials are from archival or special collections. They've been scanned or digitized and grouped together within a collection. And what's really often exciting about these collections is that previously these materials, they were kind of hidden collections, we like to say, which doesn't mean that the libraries or the librarians didn't know that these collections existed, but that the archival description is often at a much higher level, sometimes folder level, sometimes just at the collection level, so that the details of the individual items are not always made known. But when items are scanned and put into online open digital collections, these once hidden items become visible to anyone with a web connection. But this is also where having helpful descriptions, quality metadata is so incredibly important, because these are completely unique items. This isn't some red t-shirt, right? So then they're online for the first time, and having great description will help people find and use these items. So just in this example here, this is a screenshot from a collection at Western Michigan University of Civil War era letters from a Michigan soldier named Samuel Hodgman. These letters have been in the archives, in a folder for a very long time. Before being scanned. But now that they're scanned and online and described and transcribed, these are discoverable and anyone can go in and read about his experiences. So to kind of summarize all this metadata, metadata is data that provides information about other data. Metadata has types. We'll mostly focus on the descriptive types today, but there's also structural metadata for, think about multi-part items and how they connect, and administrative, like the information that helps track ownership or location. It facilitates access, most importantly, because an object online without metadata is basically invisible. It can't be found. It can assist in the management of an object, like with the administrative metadata. And it can appear in many domains, like retail or libraries, and has many available standards to help you structure and organize your description. So today we're focusing on descriptive metadata for digital collections. And I want to run through the process of designing a metadata application profile, or more simply, a map. So I think it's safe to say that we want our collections to be discoverable. So it's with that goal in mind, I want to take you back to the planning process and talk about how to make that happen. When you think when you think of your overall plan for creating a digital collection, it's important to make space in that plan for the description of your digital objects. Metadata creation is way more time consuming than you probably think. It requires a lot of decision making and research. So as part of the project plan, I create a metadata application profile, or a map, for each new collection. So what is a metadata application profile, you may ask? It's basically a guiding document. It's specific to your collection and your application or your platform. And it records your decisions on metadata structure and standards. It will help keep your metadata consistent across the life of the project, no matter how long the project takes or how many people may be working on it. And kind of like an actual map, it will guide you to where you want to go, which is a discoverable and well-described digital collection. So when determining what your application needs, look at the documentation. That's always the best place to start, especially about creating a new collection. Just for an example here, when creating a new collection in ContentID, which is a pretty common digital collections platform, you're only allowed to have your metadata structured in a few ways. The options are simple double encode, which is how you see the collection structure here in the screenshot. You can also use qualified double encode, which is like simple double encode. It builds on simple double encode, but then has some extended options. And VRA core, which is a Visual Resources Association core categories. It's a metadata scheme often used by museums. So there's just 3 options you can work with for this application. So after we know the metadata structure requirements of our application, we'll next decide what other things we want in our map. The element set, the structure, will tell you which fields you'll have access to, but you'll want to think about which of those fields are required, like a title. Everything should have a title, and which fields are repeatable, like subjects. And if your map, and in your map, you can assign certain rules to those fields too, like a particular metadata standard, which will guide what information goes into that field. So I want to talk a little bit more in detail about metadata standards for a moment, because I think they can be intimidating sometimes because there are so many. And it could be confusing to know where, when, and how we're supposed to use them. There are many of them designed for specific domains too, or kind of specialized areas of knowledge like medicine or physical sciences. So those kind of specialized standards. And some standards consist of element sets that organize the structure of your description, like double encode. And others are content standards that will tell you what you need to be describing within those elements or fields. And then there are standards that can help you format things the best way, like how to format dates. For some fields, you may want to use a controlled vocabulary, which is basically a standardized list of terms. They can be name authority files or subject headings or thesauri. They assist in the discovery of your resources, and they offer consistency across your items and collection, even across the web. which means we're all using the same words or names to describe the same thing or person. This really goes a long way to improve information retrieval and really offers a better user experience. So it's most likely that your application will be using Dublin Core as its metadata structure. The Dublin Core metadata element set is a general purpose set of about 15 core elements. It's very commonly used. It's designed for the web, and it has a robust user guide and documentation online. And there's a link down at the bottom there too for that. So these are the core 15 elements of Dublin Core. Nothing should look too odd here. Title, creator, subject, description, publisher. These are all pretty self-explanatory. So within these 15 fields, you can easily describe your digital object in a way that will be helpful to your users. The user guide online can give you direction about how to best use each field. And while I don't have time to go into detail about each element, I will be going more in depth about a few of these a little bit later in the presentation. So some of these elements are designed to be free text, like title or description, but others benefit from the use of controlled vocabularies. I'll just go into a little more detail and give some examples of some controlled vocabularies here. They are extremely useful in describing your items. Now these listed here are some kind of general purpose vocabularies. The most common of these, especially to us in the library world, is the Library of Congress authorities. They have a free web interface that you can use to find name authorities for your creators or your contributors, and the subject headings to help you describe your digital objects. And if your digital object happens to be a photograph or a visual image of some kind, the thesaurus for graphic materials, it's especially helpful in providing terms for the subject of your image or special formats. And if your image is more geographic in nature, or it's important for you to call out specific locations in your metadata, the thesaurus for geographic names is very useful for providing controlled place names. Okay, so now that we've determined the metadata structure that we need to use and the standards we're going to use, we're going to create our map. This is a sample portion of the map of what it can look like. I couldn't fit the whole thing on, but this should give you a good idea. So you'll see some people format it just in free text, kind of in a Word document, but I prefer to have it organized as a table. I find that easier to kind of understand. So in this map, I have a separate field label, which is something you can do with some applications like ContentID. So the label is what displays to the user, but the structure is still based on Dublin Core. You can see how the field is mapped to a certain DC element. And here I have chosen photographer for my label, but the field is mapped to the DC element for creator. You can also see clearly if the field is required to have data in it, or if it's recommended or optional. You can see here I've required the title in the rights field. And the column for data type and value will tell you if you should be using a controlled vocabulary or metadata standard for your data, or if it's just a free text field. So title and description are free text here, but you'll see that I've required controlled vocabularies for creator and subject, and an ISO standard for formatting dates, and a standardized rights statement provided by rightstatement.org for the rights field. So with a map to guide you, you should have a great foundation in place for this next step, which is the fun part. This is the actually creating metadata for your digital collection. So we have our map in place, and I want to get you thinking now about how to best use that map to create descriptions that will be helpful for your users and enable them to find and understand the items in your collection. So let's start with titles. Well, there are not any standards that control titles. There are many best practices in creating titles. So I want to start with a little exercise. This is a photo from our archives. I love this photo. This goat's face is fantastic. How would you title this image? Put your suggestions into the chat, and I'd love to see what everybody can come up with. Let's see if I can find, oh, there's the chat. Goat pulling, 2 children in a cart, good. Goat pulling cart with 2 children. 2 children in a cart pulled by a goat. There's only so many elements at play here, right? Yeah, handsome goat, it is a handsome goat. Yes, so we're all coming up with pretty similar titles. Yep, and I believe, oh, there's a long one. Yes, black and white photograph depicting a boy and a girl sitting in a cart pulled by a long-haired goat. Very handsome goat. All right, yes, thank you. Thank you for contributing. I believe, if you're interested, we titled this one, 2 children sitting in a cart pulled by a goat. So it looks like everybody was kind of on the same page with that. That's great. So 3 things to keep in mind when you're creating titles. Be distinctive, be informative, and be concise. So distinctive, think about if anybody would want to look at a resource that's purely titled house or girl or boat, maybe goat. But that's not very exciting. It's not very distinctive or unique. Informative, consider the 2 titles, Men on Boat versus George Washington's Crossing of the Delaware River. Which provides more information? I think we can lean towards the George Washington's Crossing of the Delaware River. We know what that is. Now, sometimes it's hard to find that balance between being distinctive and informative and being concise. Just remember that you have a much larger description field to add all those great details to. And many applications will also cut long titles short to be a certain length, and often sort titles based on title, sort all of the items within your collection based on title. So I always try not to start our titles with the or a, something a little more specific. Now you would think dates are pretty straightforward, but they can often be quite confusing. So we're used to seeing here in America the day first, then the month, then the year. But in other time periods and other places, that's not always the case. So if you see on the back of a photograph, you see written 7-6-20, it could be July 6, 2020. It could be July 6, 1920. It could be June 7, 1820. You just don't know. I mean, you can look for context clues to try to figure out, but you don't want to force your users looking at the metadata to figure that out. So it's important to keep your dates in your metadata as unambiguous as possible. And there's great news because there's a standard for that. It's called the ISO 8601 date and time format standard. ISO stands for the International Organization of Standardization. So this is a standard used across the globe and is recognized internationally. And you can see most commonly, it's that year dash month dash day, with the example of 2024-02-27. Now, if you're lucky, your photograph or letter has the date written on it, but we know we've been working with archival materials for long that we're not always so lucky. So often we have to work with a lot less. And there are ways to show that in the metadata. Maybe you know just the year and the month or just the year. There are also ways to show with question marks and X's just how much of the date you can infer. And I will say having something, even a decade, is better than nothing. And just make sure you don't use junk data or filler, kind of like ND for no date or unknown. So two fields especially important for creating helpful metadata is the description and the subject fields. And they're related. So I kind of wanted to talk about them together. So here are titles, descriptions, and subjects for two objects in our regional history photograph collection. You'll see the Alamo Center school class of 1893 and a studio portrait of a standing fireman from Kalamazoo, Michigan. And each have subjects, a sepia mounted photograph from the 1893 class standing on steps at the entrance to Alamo Center School, Alamo Township, Michigan. You'll see that we tried to, trying to cover like the what, where, and who in our description. And in the subjects, we were able to use controlled vocabularies to call out the important facts or details of the object. So under the Alamo Center School class, in red, you'll see the Library of Congress authorities, schools, which is a subject, and Alamo Center School, Michigan, which is a name authority. Now, with the first one in green, we have added a geographic subdivision to that subject heading of Michigan and Alamo Township. It was important to us that we had the geographic division in the subject, but it would have been also okay to leave that geographic information out and only have it maybe in a location field. It's really dependent on what kind of, how you want your metadata and your subjects interacting with each other in the collection. In purple there, we have added two terms for the thesaurus of graphic materials, which is great for providing the more specific terms of one-room schools and school children. We did kind of the similar for the firefighter with the Library of Congress subject heading of firefighters with the geographic subdivisions of Michigan and Kalamazoo. And then all of the other information like studio portraits that we're able to get from the thesaurus of graphic materials. One hint too is that when you are adding subjects, try to have the most important subject first, the one that's going to be the most helpful to your users. Now I want to show you a couple kind of complete metadata records for some digital objects. I have two, and I'm really sorry the text is so small. I did my best to fit it on as well as I could, but I will just kind of read and describe what is here if you can't read it, because I know it's small. So this is metadata for a photograph in the platform, in a platform that requires the use of Dublin Core. This uses qualified Dublin Core for its structure. The title is Exterior View of the Ladies Library Association, Kalamazoo, Michigan. The date is 1880. We know this because it was written on the back of the card. We have a field labeled location, which is a qualified Dublin Core element of coverage spatial. But that's coverage spatial isn't very exciting. So location we found to be a better label for that. Subjects include the name heading for the Ladies Library Association, Library of Congress subject heading for historic buildings and societies and clubs, and also cabinet photographs, which is a kind of genre from the thesaurus of graphic materials. The source field, which is a simple Dublin Core field, describes the physical properties of the item, the source of the digital collection or the digital object, and it describes the physical size of 6.5 by 4 inches, sepia tone photograph. It's from our university and the Ladies Library Association collection, and then it has a succession number. So we know that this digital object came from this physical object and where it came from. And then there's a field with the label of collection. Now we gave this label to the qualified Dublin Core element of relation is part of, because that's a mouthful, and collection is much more user-friendly. The publisher field is filled with Western Michigan University because we are considered the digital publisher of this digital item. And the rights field here displays as the text and the kind of the URI for the standardized rights statement for no copyright in the United States. Now you can also have a more free text rights field that's simply copyright your organization. Although there has been a move to standardize that field for more interoperability and clarity. Type is image. You can see it's a digitized photograph. Format, this is a TIFF, so it's image TIFF. And these fields, type and format, they're described in the Dublin Core documentation of what should go in those fields. And the identifier is a unique string developed especially for this collection using our file name conventions. And the name string is also used in the file name for this image. You might notice that there's no creator or language here. We don't know who took the picture, and there wasn't textual content, so it didn't require a language tag. And our system will not display empty fields. So that was a lot of description in there. I have just one more here to show you kind of a complete thing. So this next example comes from a content DM collection that also uses qualified Dublin Core. I won't read out every field, but we'll see that there is a creator and a language field since we know who wrote the letter, and his name authority from the Library of Congress is there for Samuel Hodgman. And we know that he wrote it in English, even though the handwriting is not always the easiest to read. It is in English. So we've added a contributor field as well, which is another simple Dublin Core element. Since this item was transcribed, and so we've added the name of the transcriber. So with all that metadata swirling in your head, I want to briefly touch on some of the practical stuff and talk about tools and workflow for metadata creation. I don't see any questions in the chat right now, so I will move on, and you're welcome to save your questions for the end too. So in picking your tool, you're going to want to work a tool that's going to work best with the type of metadata you're creating. We focused today mainly on Dublin Core, but there are some systems that use an XML-based standard called mods. Now, working in XML requires different tools. So if you have questions specifically to that, you're welcome to ask some at the end there. But I'm going to focus on Dublin Core right now. So when using Dublin Core, you can easily use tabular data to ingest metadata for multiple records at once. Tabular data or data in tables, most commonly referred to as spreadsheets. As a metadata librarian, I live most of my life in spreadsheets. I love spreadsheets. So of course there's the Microsoft Office Excel, but there is also free software, which I actually prefer for metadata creation, called LibreOffice Calc. And I prefer it because it's a bit more stripped down than Excel, and won't try to format everything as dates unless you want it to. And of course the price is great, which is free. There is also Google Sheets, which can be especially helpful if you need an online solution for multiple people to contribute. And there's also a very powerful tool called OpenRefine. This is a free tool which can help you clean up messy spreadsheets, messy data. It does take there's a bit of a learning curve in using OpenRefine, but it can be really helpful if you need to really do some cleanup. So there are some practical considerations when working with tabular metadata. Start by reviewing how your application wants to ingest your metadata. I know that for ContentDM, you use the web interface, or you can use the web interface to edit or add individual items, which is great for testing if you want to test a new collection. But of course, adding one at a time will take you forever. ContentDM, I also know, has its own separate project client, which can handle bulk ingest. Not all applications do. Other platforms require you to upload a specially formatted spreadsheets. Maybe it's a tab delimited or CSV format. So your documentation should tell you exactly what you need as far as that's concerned. If you're lucky, your platform will allow you to download a template spreadsheet. We have a system called Luna, which not many people work in, but that's one great feature where you can actually download the spreadsheet, which is great because then you know all of the field names, which are column headers in your spreadsheet, will be exactly the right way, so it will ingest properly later. So in most cases, also repeatable fields like subjects, they might need their own column. Make sure you avoid text formatting like bold or italics. They just won't transfer. And also remember that some systems won't let you use special characters either. It's best to keep your text simple and clean. And also remember that spreadsheets with million columns are already cumbersome. So try to keep your batches to a manageable size. I try to keep my batches as I'm working with images and metadata to about 50 to 100 items tops. Anything beyond that can get a little bit much to work with. And this is just a close-up of part of a metadata spreadsheet. Of course, a real metadata spreadsheet will be like really long, tons of columns. But you can see how the field names are the column headers. And each row is itself a different digital object, as you can see by its unique identifier along the side here. And if an object doesn't use a certain field, like how one of them here doesn't have a creator, the Alamo Center's class of 1893, leave it empty. One little trick is to make sure you watch out for leading or trailing empty spaces. Keep it, your text clean and organized. And also, one fun thing that can also save you a lot of time and really be efficient is to cut and paste as often you can for those fields that are similar throughout. I just want to show you briefly a very kind of high level workflow for metadata creation. This is similar to kind of the workflow that I use. So think about coming to this metadata part of it, this workflow after, and maybe you have done the digitizing of your objects. So you have a nice folder there with all of your digital images, nice file names, and you've done the work at creating your map. You set up the collection in your digital collections platform, and you're ready to create metadata. So you start by gathering all the things you need. You have your images to look at while you're describing them. You have your map for reference. And if you're lucky, you may also have a basic inventory or scanning checklist to work with. I'm really lucky because the person who does our digitization is very organized. And she creates scanning logs as she works and records things like the original size of the item, anything written on it on the back, and things like the DPI she scanned it at, all this great stuff. I mean, it's just gold because it's way easier to start with something than with nothing. So that can be really helpful. And then from that, I'll create my metadata spreadsheet to match the structure of my application. I'll use the downloaded template if I have access to one. And then I'll spend many, many hours describing these amazing things. And I'll do my first quality control check when I think I'm done. I'll do a spell check because you don't want to find spelling errors later on. And then I'll save it in whatever format's required, probably a tab delimited CSV file, just what my system wants. And then I will upload that spreadsheet with the corresponding images to my system. And then the system does all the fun matching things. Most of my systems match on file names. So it'll look for that line of metadata that has that file name in it, and it'll match it to the image that has the right file name. And hopefully everything will match up. It has to be exact. And once it's in there and it's done the matching, I'll do another round of quality control, make sure everything is matched to something. Matched to the right thing. And I'll look at the metadata and I'll look at the metadata fields to make sure everything is where it should be and what it should be. Of course, fix any errors that you might find, and then consider it published and share the good news with everybody. And with that, I just want to leave you with a couple of quick takeaways. Remember that metadata provides access. We can do all the scanning we want, but unless those images are properly described, remember they'll be invisible online. Make sure to create a map. Give yourself clear directions, and whoever's coming to add to the collection later, clear directions on how to create the metadata. And remember that standards create consistency and clarity, which leads to a good user experience with your collection. And good descriptions do take time. I always tell people that describing your collection can often take 3 times as long as scanning it. There's a lot of work that goes into creating good quality descriptions. But it's worth it because metadata is a love note to the future. All that hard work you're putting into describing your items will pay off for your lucky users down the line. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have about anything we covered today.
Great. Thank you so much, Marianne. Yep, people should feel free to either unmute yourselves or drop questions in the chat, and we will get those answered. I have a question to start off with. When you generate your map, your metadata application profile, do you keep those and store those with your metadata records, or where do those live?
Sure. So we have a pretty kind of standardized file organization system for all our digital collections. So each collection gets its own top folder, and within that, there's folders for the images, folders for the metadata, and a folder for documentation. So in that documentation, we will have the metadata application profile. We will have any other project planning documents. If there's questions about copyright, that all goes in that documentation folder. So everything is in one place when we want to go and find out about that collection.
Great, thanks. Looks like there is a question in the chat. Can you give an example of how a system attaches images to the record?
Sure. Oh boy. I'm trying to think of, I mean, I have a visual right now of our Luna system, which the back end, it's a drag and drop system where you drag and drop all of your images and you drag and drop your CSV file, and you can see it like all there's a little bar and you can see all of the images loading. And then when it gets down to the spreadsheet, you can see it loading the spreadsheet, and then suddenly everything populates, the metadata next to the images. And you tell it what field you want it to match on. It can match on the identifier, but really you're going to want to match on the file name, because that's really the only information attached to the image itself is the image file name. And so that file name will go into as a column in your metadata spreadsheet. And it has to be exact. So then the system will identify that these things to match, and it will connect them within the system. I know that's probably not as visual as you want. Does that kind of explain how that works enough? Okay, good.
Right. Any other questions? Oh. Okay, Jeff and group ask, for prospective cataloging and metadata librarians, which specific standards and tools are potentially most useful or valuable for public libraries?
Yeah. Boy. So I remember back in library school in my organization of knowledge class, we did touch on a number of standards. Of course, cataloging, your main kind of standard is MARC, which is, machine readable. That's your catalog record. And within the catalog record, there's a lot of different content standards. There's resource description and access. And then there's all the kind of vocabularies too. Of course, the Library of Congress catalog, name authorities and the Library of Congress subject headings are important. If you work with rare books, there's specific things. So it really kind of depends on what you focus on. LC headings and name authorities in a MARC record, that's a great place to start when you're learning. If you're going to work with digital collections outside of a traditional library catalog, Dublin Core that's a great place to start because it is so widely used. It's simplified. So learn Dublin Core, and then if you have graphic material, that thesaurus of graphic materials are a really great vocabulary to learn. With just those, you should be able to start describing things pretty well for any type of library. That should be those are good places to start.
Definitely. And the good thing is that if they're standards, then they're probably or hopefully widely adopted. And so there's a lot of documentation to help with those. And not only that, but you can crosswalk between different metadata standards. So if you start with Dublin Core and you want to scale up to mods eventually, that you can do that. If you start with mods, it's usually best not to go backwards because they usually aren't as granular. But you're not locked into a specific schema or standard. But it's good to do some research and assess your collection so you can create that metadata application profile ahead of time and plan what you're going to use. So you don't have to go back and change things later because that's all time. This is very time intensive work that Marianne does daily. So, all right. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add on that using standards does help with that process of crosswalking. Because if you have a bunch of unstandardized metadata, it's not going to match if you need to move it to a new system. So yes, standardized is the way to go. It'll help you. You'll be thankful later on.
Somebody asked, what are current standard image formats? Do you mean
that seems almost more like a digitization question.
Yeah, for the person who asked this question, is this for file formats, or are you talking about description of the original format? And while we wait for an answer on that, I'll move on to Erin's question. I have a binder of photocopies of a funeral home's records dated 1880 to 1960. Does the whole of the binder get one line of metadata with several images, or does each page get its own line? And are the people recorded listed in the description, subject, or other fields, or not at all?
Well, that sounds fascinating. And a lot of it is going to depend on what you want to do with that collection. I mean, it's a binder. You could think of that as like a volume, and if you scan every page, create a like one digital item that has everything in it, but then you're going to be describing it at a much higher level. You'd probably describe that as at a folder level of like records from this place during these dates, and you probably would be able to call out all that individual information on each page. Now, if you want to take all those items from that binder, scan each one, and each one becomes its own individual item and record, you can describe things at an item level. And this is kind of all part of like project planning of what you guys have capacity to do, what your platform is going to let you do. And then if you have each page scanned, and maybe it's for one person, and you decide you want to describe that at an item level, then yeah, you can call out specific information to that page, and hopefully that will give you more specific dates too, than just a general date range. So a lot of it's going to be in how you design that collection. Make it what you want, how it's going to be the most useful.
Thank you. All right, we have some clarification on the earlier question. It says, are the images attached to catalog high res or just the thumbnails? I was guessing that the files would be digitally accessible.
So within the system, you will upload the full image, not a thumbnail image, but the full image. And sometimes the system will actually generate the thumbnails from that full image as part of the automated process, depending on the system.
Yeah, so kind of how Marianne was talking before about like the stand. There's the stand, which is the work, and then there's all the representations of the stand, right? So you can consider that the catalog record describes in general that photograph or that image, and then it applies to all the different iterations of that, like the preservation copy, the JPEG copy, those sorts of things. So yes, that's a really good question. And what are the format standards for attached image for digital access? The formats. What are the format standards? So the file format for the access copy? I mean, there's standards and best practices for digital images for file type. Okay. That will depend on a lot of different things. So we can answer this question if you want to message me afterwards. I'm happy to connect with you about that. We can follow up about that. All right. When you publish, do the images become publicly usable? What do you mean by usable?
Well, and you know, to have the images out there doesn't always mean that they are usable in the way like anybody can grab them and put them in their book or put them in a, you know, that really depends on how you set up your rights statement. Some platforms will allow for downloading of content. Some platforms will restrict downloading of content. So it's just viewable on there. The rights statements, which is rightstatements.org, one thing they are really trying to make very clear is the usability of that image. So once an image is out of copyright and it's more reusable, it can be reusable by people. But if that image is still in copyright, it is not reusable. So with your rights statement, you want to be very clear to the end user who is viewing that item online, what they are able to do or not do with that item.
A lot of times people will put things like watermarks on access images to try and further restrict that, because when something is on the internet, whether or not it's legally usable or usable in actuality are different. So people do tend to use things, but yes, you should be able to indicate what the use of that material is. We have one last question and then we're going to wrap up. So Marianne, this is, do any particular cataloging and metadata certification programs, like such as those at the University of Wisconsin, actually carry any weight in the hiring process for somebody who already has an MLIS but minimal professional cataloging and metadata experience?
Oh boy. I mean, getting extra professional development and training and certifications, I think is always helpful. even for people who have been working in the field for a very long time. I'm always trying to go to conferences and finding webinars and taking classes. So yeah, it's important to keep doing that. And I mean, the best way to learn is through experience. But I think starting off with a lot of good education is good. And I think a lot of those certificate programs, like the University of Wisconsin, which I'm familiar with, they will actually have you creating metadata and catalog records as part of the program. So hopefully that's a beginning of experience. And then those will also give you the language and the terms, and to be able to talk about the process in whatever hiring process you are. So being able to understand kind of the ins and outs of it and the platforms and some of the standards, that information, that's all good to know.
Yeah.
Hopefully that was helpful.
Thanks so much. All right. So Mary, if you will go to the next slide, I just want to let folks know that the next class in our series, in this How to Pick series, is How to Pick Your Policy, creating a digital preservation policy. And in April, I'll be joined by Dr. Chelsea Denault, who's the coordinator for the Michigan Digital Preservation Network. She's going to be discussing how to ensure long-term access to your digital collections that you now have described, obviously. And you learn how to craft, implement, and maintain a digital preservation policy. So I've dropped in the chat the link to register for that. That is April 30th. And last thing I wanted to do was just thank you for attending. Thank you to Marianne for this wonderful webinar. Thank you to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for making this webinar series possible. And if you would mind taking just a quick second, it's a 4-question survey that provides feedback on the program. So it allows us to create and craft and improve the services and programs that we offer here at the Library of Michigan. So I've dropped in the chat the link to the survey for this. So thank you very, very much. We really appreciate you all attending today and your thoughtful and insightful questions. And we look forward to seeing your collections described online.